Mikael Hildén, Professor, as I told you, of the Finnish Environment Institute, leading the climate change programme, and he concentrates his research on climate and environmental policy. He's also a former chair of the expert group on black carbon and methane under the Arctic Council. The EU has funded, you probably know this already, an initiative called Action on Black Carbon in the Arctic. In the long-term aim, it aims to reduce black carbon emissions across the whole of the Arctic region. And it also supports continuing systems for cooperation that aim to protect the Arctic environment. This EU initiative is not just a compilation of sources and emissions of black carbon. Researchers have also looked into how to turn knowledge into action by cooperating internationally, using this knowledge to guide policy. In his keynote speech, Dr. Hildén will outline the roadmap 2020 to 2030 for black carbon action that the EU-funded programme Action on Black Carbon in the Arctic is currently finalising. He'll talk about the many different routes needed to reduce the emissions of black carbon affecting the Arctic. So, Dr. Hildén, how have you become involved with black carbon, and why is black carbon significant at all? We look forward very much to hearing from you, Dr. Hildén.
Okay, thank you, Rene. Indeed, I got involved through the environmental policy work, looking into various aspects of climate change and ways to mitigate climate change, and then also the various co-benefits. And that complexity is actually for policies, for scholars of policy like myself, that is quite a challenging but also interesting area. So here you have me, and we'll look into the multiple pathways in a little while.
I look forward to your keynote speech, if that is okay.
Okay, thank you very much, the Northern Dimension Institute and all the other organizers for giving me this opportunity, and to all dear participants throughout everywhere. The theme of my speech is the multiple pathways needed to reduce emissions of black carbon affecting the Arctic. So we can jump straight into the next slide. Okay, the black carbon, as has been alluded to already in the introductory remarks, is a complex material with many different side effects. It's not as elusive as the dark matter of the universe, but it's challenging in its own right. And I'm happy to give some ideas on the work that is going on under the EU-funded action. And when I'm presenting, I'm certainly not presenting only my own thoughts or my own ideas, but this is a collective effort by a group of institutes and people involved in them who have been working on this topic for now some years. And the action is really about finding the possible collective responses to reduce black carbon emissions in the Arctic. The next slide, please. So we know that black carbon is emitted from many sources and that it also has multiple effects. So that this picture in this slide illustrates these many different pathways, both when it comes to sources, when it comes to the spreading of the emissions, and when it comes to the effect both on the incoming sun, which some particles may actually hinder the sun from reaching the Earth, whereas others, in particular in the Arctic, falling on snow and ice will enhance the heating effect of the sun. So we are dealing with a complex set of processes that the black carbon causes. And this means that it is an issue both for air quality, like Rene was saying in the beginning, it's part of the small particle emissions in general. And then also, like in the subsequent session, it will be an issue for health And it's related also and linked to climate change in many different ways, both as a heating agent, but also, of course, when it comes to the forest fires, it's a loss of the carbon sinks that then turns into black carbon. So there are indeed many pathways. And the next slide, please. When we then zoom in on the Arctic and look at what causes black carbon emissions and that reach the Arctic, we find that the Arctic Council countries and the observers account for about half of the black carbon reaching the Arctic. Now, that is, of course, an important part of the story. And as I mentioned, that the Arctic has become a center for the concern, probably because black carbon is so obvious and visible when it lands on white snow surfaces, and in particular in the melting period. But that doesn't mean that it's not an issue or a problem for the rest of the world. First of all, part of it is the air quality issue that we will come back to certainly, and probably also in many of the comments. And then in other parts of the world, there are also significant emissions of black carbon that affect both local snows and glaciers, but also importantly, again, the health issues. So we are dealing with indeed a complex set of substances, set of material. And the next slide we can get. And this complexity means that there are lots of potential actors involved. So when we are aiming for emission reductions, there's a need for international cooperation. And the whole sort of carrying idea of this black carbon action on the Arctic is to look for the possible areas where international cooperation can be enhanced in one way or another. Because, as this slide illustrates, there are a number of important actors. So from the Arctic Council, which raised the concern in their policy document, we have the UNECE, the Air Convention, we have the IPCC providing the scientific background, the Climate Clean Air Coalition giving impetus to action, the OECD on economic calculations, the IMO on the shipping, the Air Convention, the Paris Convention of the United Nations, and the EU. So all of these actors have a role to play, and the purpose of a roadmap in general is, of course, to find the right way to navigate from various in a complex environment to the end result that we wish to see. And the logo of SYKE here on this slide can be said to represent the many national research institutes that are also involved and feed into this. The next slide, please. In developing the roadmap, the first thing was, of course, to identify the existing and potential areas of cooperation. And in this work, 5 main areas have been singled out. So there were the domestic heating, gas flaring as part of the oil and gas production, maritime shipping, and the off-road and on-road transport with diesel engines in particular, also including stationary diesels, and then open burning of biomass, both as an agricultural practice, but also in particular then significant for the Arctic are the wildfires occurring over vast areas in some regions. But then in addition to these areas of substance, we also have the questions of monitoring of emissions. So we need to know, in order to take action, where the emissions actually occur and how big they are. And then when we are talking about the impacts on the Arctic, we need to know how much of those emissions actually reach the Arctic and in what form. So these 2 levels of monitoring are also needed in order to deal with these 5 complex areas of substance. Next slide. I think it's important to recognize that these areas of action differ in nature, and also by that token, the possible action and cooperation will be different depending on the area. So if we start with the emitters, we have in some of the areas, we have large point sources, such as the oil and gas production, which are identifiable even from satellites by their flares. And on the other hand, on the other extreme, we have the small-scale diffuse operations such as heating, domestic heating, or off-road transport, which are occurring over a large area, and their impact arises because of their large number, not by their single emissions. And it's significant to consider these differences because, on one hand, when you have a few large emitters, it's possible to engage in negotiations and commitments with these particular actors. Whereas when you have numerous actors, it's a question of nudging their behavior, of giving signals that how to change the behavior in such a way that the emission sources are addressed. The second level, you could say, is the institutions, the differences in institutions. In some of the areas, marine shipping being a prime example, you have strong international organizations that have an established way of operating a clear set mandate. And then you have, on the other hand, domestic and local authorities that operate partly on their own, with some cooperation, with some initiatives carrying over. And the implications for the areas of actions is that when you're dealing with strong institutions that have established practices, it's about developing and agreeing on common standards and protocols. Whereas if there are numerous small actors and authorities that have limited local power, it's a question of developing criteria for design so that these low emission solutions are replicated across the board. And then finally, there's a difference in the frequency of emissions. You have the continuous emissions such as those arising from, let's say, transport or from domestic heating, versus those that are accidental, in particular, such as those caused by wildfires, or temporary, such as those due to burning of agricultural waste. Next slide. So then, what do we have in terms of cooperative actions? Some of the areas are prone or have a possibility for harmonization of regulation and criteria. We know from historical studies of also emissions from many different sources that by establishing harmonized regulation across large areas, it's possible to stimulate innovations and new solutions. And that's exactly what has happened in, say, for example, the car industry that has achieved substantial reductions in the emissions from diesels. And these will spill over also to machinery, to stationary tools and so on. So it's important, but it's not possible in all instances to come up with harmonized regulations and criteria, but that could be or should be an important part of the cooperative actions, in particular when we are dealing with those areas which have strong institutional backing. Then, in particular for the monitoring, we have the question of sharing and joint development of information systems that can communicate with one another. So the data exchange and the interoperability of the systems, even though we would not have a full-blown standardized sampling system or so, but when things are harmonized and communicate with one another, we are able to generate knowledge and understanding that is needed for taking action. On many of the areas, we can say that carrying out various piloting, exchanging the good practices and providing material for awareness raising is quite an important in this, which I referred to earlier as nudging. So the changing of behavior is a very complex event. This morning I participated in a discussion with economists on climate change issues, and they said, well, we know very little about how to change people's behavior really by various incentives. And black carbon is no exception to this rule. So it's a question of manifold awareness raising, and by exchanging information of what is successful, what is good practice, we may achieve quite substantial change in, for example, switching from agricultural practices that are based or used extensively, burning of residue on the fields, to practices that do not. And then finally, we do have, of course, an important task and an important possibility for cooperative action at the level of research and development and innovation. The low emission technologies do not and should not know any borders, and so does not the research. So by developing this and again piloting and also communicating with the harmonization of regulation, it's possible to make progress. So it's about this whole setting is about developing joint policies in a harmonized way at the transnational level. So different actors in the previous slide can come together, and there are some of these, such as the regional operator of the Arctic Council, that can bring a lot together and also have specific actions at the piloting stage that can help in making this progress. Next slide. As I mentioned, the joint monitoring is really a key in this work. So because it becomes a base for the evaluation and learning. And the two basic questions are, say, alluded to earlier, how much black carbon is emitted where? This is necessary in order to focus the actions to see what are the cost-efficient, cost-effective solutions. And to achieve this, we need both improved mandatory reporting in terms of quality control and harmonized methods, and also like the reporting activities. Part of it is voluntary, part of it's by the Air Convention, part under the Arctic Council, possibly in the future also more extensively under the Paris Agreement, which currently does not recognize the black carbon as a specific area of action. And then the other question is how much of this black carbon does actually reach the Arctic. The calculations and scenarios that have been made suggest that black carbon emissions could be reduced by even up to 70%. And how will this be reflected in the Arctic? So it's the question also of tracking the global effectiveness of the actions taken. Next slide. And so in coming to the key point that in order to get this reduction going, we need a pathway for the emissions, and the roadmap is actually about finding the roles of these different actors that were mentioned in one of the first slides, seeing how they interact in these different substance areas with their different roles and different capacities that provide information, provide policies, provide a platform or forum for exchanging the good practice. And with these combined joint effort through the roadmap-like ideas, it is possible to find both the harmonized policies, find the piloting and demonstration that is needed to show that the new solutions are actually viable, and then coming back to the monitoring and evaluation that teaches us whether the actions are successful, and teaches us also how we should adjust, if needed, the policies to become even more efficient. And this process is, of course, partly going on within the Arctic Council, but this slide serves to stress that it is not the business of one organization. It is really an area where we do need the transnational cooperation with different organizations taking on different roles. And when this is carried out, then this wiggly line of lowering the emissions from 2010 level to 2030 by 70% could become reality. Next slide, please. So with that, I will thank you for your attention and look forward to the discussion that this hopefully will lead to. And as in the link to for the call of this conference or meeting, you saw the link to the summary of the roadmap, and that summary can also be distributed to anybody who wishes to have it. So thank you very much for your attention, and